In the summer of 1942, as the Wehrmacht regrouped after its first strategic setback in the Soviet Union, a new campaign began to form within Hitler's high command. The defeat before Moscow in the winter of 1941–1942 had cost Army Group Center over 200,000 casualties and forced a recalibration of German expectations in the East. Yet Hitler remained convinced that the Soviet Union's ability to resist was nearing collapse. The failure to take Moscow did not shift the Nazi leadership's belief in their military superiority. It simply redirected their ambitions. The Axis focus turned south, toward the vast industrial and oil-rich territories of the Caucasus and the lower Volga. The economic rationale was explicit. German forces required secure access to petroleum, and the Caucasus oil fields, particularly around Maikop, Grozny, and Baku, represented the largest such reserves within reach. Simultaneously, the Volga River held immense strategic value as a principal Soviet transport artery, moving men, materials, and oil between the North and the Caspian Basin. Severing this line would strike a severe blow to Soviet logistics. The German plan, known as Case Blue, Fall Blau, was formulated throughout April and May of 1942 and authorized in Directive No. 41 on April 5. Unlike the broad front offensives of 1941, Case Blue was designed as a two-pronged push, one toward the Caucasus and its oil fields, the other toward the city of Stalingrad on the Volga. The city bore the Soviet leader's name, but beyond its symbolic significance, Stalingrad was a major industrial center, producing armaments, tractors, and machinery, and a key railway and river transport node. Capturing it would isolate southern Russia and support the push into the Caucasus by protecting the northern flank. By contrast, the Soviet Union was still recovering from the devastation. Operation Barbarossa had cost the Red Army nearly 3 million men killed, wounded, or captured. However, Soviet industrial relocation to the east, mass conscription, and mobilization efforts were rapidly replenishing depleted forces. In early 1942, Stalin's counteroffensives around Kharkov and in the Crimea had ended in failure, but they demonstrated a clear intention. The Soviet Union would not yield territory without a fight. The Red Army's numerical strength was increasing, and the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, began reassigning units to the southern front. Intelligence estimates pointed to renewed German operations in the south, but Stalin and his staff underestimated the scale and direction of the attack. The Soviet southwestern and Stalingrad fronts were being reinforced, but many divisions were under strength or lacked adequate training and equipment. Still, Stalin ordered no retreat from the city that bore. On the German side, Army Group South was reorganized into Army Groups A and B. Army Group B, under General Maximilian von Weichs, was tasked with taking Stalingrad, while Army Group A, under General Wilhelm List, would strike into the Caucasus. This division of forces was controversial among German generals. Some, including General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, argued that splitting the offensive might leave both thrusts undersupported. However, Hitler personally overrode objections. In the months leading up to the battle, Germany's Eastern Front strength was approximately 3.2 million men, with about 1 million allocated to the southern sector. The Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, was the principal formation assigned to Stalingrad. It consisted of 250,000 men and over 500 tanks, supported by the 4th Panzer Army and elements of Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian Allied forces. Meanwhile, the Soviet Southern Front, later restructured into the Stalingrad Front under General Andrei Yeryomenko, held approximately 300,000 troops initially, though reserves from the Don and Volga regions were steadily moving in. By August 1942, the Soviet command aimed to hold the river line and delay the German advance, buying time for strategic reserves to arrive. Public sentiment in Germany was still largely supportive of the war effort. Nazi propaganda emphasized the need to destroy the Bolshevik threat and secure resources for Germany's survival. In the Soviet Union, the fall of 1941 had shifted the tone of wartime messaging. The slogans of communist expansion were replaced by appeals to patriotism, homeland defense, and revenge for atrocities committed by the occupiers. German atrocities in occupied Soviet territory, including the mass execution, a divided German command structure, overextended logistics, and massive strategic ambitions, were about to collide with an industrial city on the Volga, one that would soon become a graveyard for hundreds of thousands. The Battle of Stalingrad would not be decided quickly. It would evolve into a war of attrition, fought not just in open steppe or along rivers, but street by street, floor by floor. A confrontation that would define the future of the Eastern Front. The German offensive toward Stalingrad began in earnest in late June 1942, with Operation Blue formally launched on June 28. Army Group B, spearheaded by the 6th Army and supported by the 4th Panzer Army, advanced rapidly through the Don Basin, breaking through thin Soviet defensive lines stretched over hundreds of kilometers. By mid-July, German spearheads had reached the Don River, setting the stage for the push toward Stalingrad. The Wehrmacht utilized combined arms tactics honed during the previous year, coordinating armor, infantry, and close air support from Luftflotte 4 under General von Richthofen. The initial Soviet response was fragmented. Units under the command of General Timoshenko attempted to slow the advance during the Second Battle of Kharkov, but were encircled and lost over 200,000 men by the end of May. Further attempts to stabilize the line along the Don failed, and Soviet formations fell back in disarray. By the end of July, German units had crossed the Don at multiple points, and forward elements of the 6th Army were approaching the outer suburbs of Stalingrad. The city, stretching nearly 50 kilometers along the western bank of the Volga, was not a single cohesive defensive point, but a linear sprawl of industrial complexes, housing districts, and logistical hubs. Its urban terrain, mixed with ravines, railways, and factory zones, presented unique challenges for both attackers and the Soviet High Command began reinforcing the city with elements from the 62nd and 64th Armies, commanded by Generals Vasily Chuikov and Mikhail Shumilov. By mid-August, defensive positions were established in and around the city, including trenches, fortified buildings, and fallback positions along the riverbank. On August 23, 1942, German units reached the northern suburbs of Stalingrad and launched a massive bombing raid. Over 1,000 sorties by the Luftwaffe that day destroyed much of the central city, killing an estimated 40,000 civilians and reducing entire districts to rubble. Yet this destruction would ultimately aid Soviet defense, transforming the city into a maze of ruins ideal for ambushes, sniper positions, and concealed movement. The German command did not anticipate how effectively the Red Army would exploit the shattered terrain. Hitler demanded daily reports and often issued direct orders to corps-level commanders. General Paulus, in his first independent command role, was under pressure to deliver quick results. Stalin, having declared that not a step back was to be taken, appointed political commissars to enforce discipline and sent General Zhukov to coordinate the broader defense of the Southern Front. Soviet reinforcements, including penal battalions and conscripts from newly mobilized divisions, were dispatched across the Volga under constant German artillery and air fire. The early engagements inside the city were marked by ferocious house-to-house combat. The German 71st Infantry Division entered the northern districts, encountering resistance in the form of sniper teams, booby-trapped buildings, and Soviet units using the sewers and underground tunnels for movement. Progress was slow and costly. In late August, the Germans captured the tractor factory district, but failed to secure a crossing of the Volga or fully encircle the Soviet forces within the city. By September, the Soviet 62nd Army had effectively transformed the city into a series of mutually supporting strongpoints. Buildings such as Pavlov's house, the Red October factory, and the Barricade complex became symbols of Soviet resistance. Every floor, stairwell, and window became contested terrain. German attempts to seize the high ground at Mamayev Kurgan were repelled repeatedly, despite the deployment of heavy artillery and close air support. The cost in men and materiel rose rapidly. German divisions began reporting attrition rates of 25 to 40% in some units. On the German side, the logistical burden of sustaining operations deep into Soviet territory began to tell. Supplies of ammunition, food, and fuel had to be moved hundreds of kilometers. The extension of the front to cover both the Caucasus and Stalingrad severely strained the Wehrmacht's capacity. Meanwhile, the Soviets were transporting reinforcements across the Volga under the cover of darkness, using small boats, rafts, and barges. Though many were sunk or damaged by German artillery, enough made it across to keep the defense alive. By mid-September, nearly 270,000 Axis troops were engaged in and around Stalingrad. The Soviets had committed over 400,000 men to the broader defense of the region, though not all were concentrated in the city. Daily combat consumed thousands of lives. In just 1 month, German losses exceeded 40,000 killed and wounded. Soviet casualties were even higher, with some estimates suggesting over 75,000 losses in the same period. Despite the devastation, neither side showed signs of relenting. The Germans believed the Soviet forces would collapse under the pressure, while the Soviets, with the Volga at their backs, had no option but to hold or die. The battle was no longer merely a military objective. It had become a symbol of political will, national survival, and strategic prestige. As the weeks turned into months, the full scale of what Stalingrad represented to both sides would begin to reveal itself. With both armies entrenched in brutal close-quarter combat, the strategic goals of the opposing sides began to shift under the weight of reality. What had begun for Germany as part of a broader operational plan to secure the Caucasus oil fields and cut Soviet logistics now increasingly centered on the symbolic and psychological conquest of Stalingrad itself. For the Soviets, what was initially a defensive holding action evolved into a long-term strategic trap, one that would eventually consume an entire German army. By October 1942, Hitler had ordered that the city be taken at all costs. The Führer's obsession with capturing Stalingrad had become both strategic and personal. Nazi propaganda had elevated the battle as a defining moment of German supremacy, and failure was now politically unacceptable. This led to increasingly rigid and unrealistic operational decisions. General Paulus was denied permission to break off or redeploy forces, despite warnings from his staff and frontline reports of severe attrition and diminishing combat effectiveness. The Sixth Army's original goal of securing the Volga and protecting the flank of Army Group A had become secondary to the symbolic value of taking the city. Soviet planners under Stalin and Stavka leadership, including Generals Vasilevsky and Zhukov, recognized that the German concentration at Stalingrad presented an opportunity. While urban combat dragged on inside the city, Red Army forces outside it began preparing for a counteroffensive. By mid-October, vast Soviet reserves, including over 1 million men, 13,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 1,000 tanks, were being concentrated on the flanks of the German positions, particularly those held by Romanian and Italian units to the north and south of the city. These Axis allies were poorly equipped and underprepared for sustained Soviet mechanized assault. Soviet aerial reconnaissance and partisan reports confirmed that German command had not reinforced these sectors adequately. Inside Stalingrad, both sides continued to suffer catastrophic losses. German units, including the 24th Panzer Division, 14th Panzer Division, and the 100th Jaeger Division, were locked in block-by-block fighting, often unable to advance more than a few meters in a day. The city's industrial complexes had become fortresses. The Red October factory, for instance, was attacked and retaken several times in a single week. The Barricadi gun factory and the Lazur chemical plant became killing zones, where tanks could only maneuver in narrow corridors and infantry losses were extreme. German flamethrower teams, Stuka dive bombers, and assault guns tried to break Soviet lines, but defenders kept emerging from the rubble. The Luftwaffe continued its support role, but by November, fuel shortages, Soviet anti-aircraft defenses, and worsening weather had limited its effectiveness. Bombers and transport aircraft faced increasing risks, and German air superiority began to erode. At the same time, Soviet artillery and Katyusha rocket barrages intensified, making every square kilometer of Stalingrad a lethal zone. Entire battalions disappeared in assaults that achieved no meaningful gain. Soviet command adapted rapidly to the conditions. Small unit tactics, sniper teams, and sapper groups disrupted German advances and One of the most famous defenders, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, held a 4-story apartment building for nearly 2 months, using overlapping fields of fire and pre-planned fallback positions. Pavlov's house, as it came to be known, became a microcosm of the broader Soviet resistance effort. Even as ammunition ran low and communications broke down, units refused to retreat. The NKVD troops and commissars ensured compliance with Stalin's orders, often at gunpoint, but many soldiers fought on with or without coercion. German reports indicated an increasing breakdown of morale, supply, and coherence. Units were being rotated out of the front lines at rates that could not match the tempo of combat. Medical support collapsed under the pressure. German field hospitals, overwhelmed and undersupplied, had no capacity for the growing number of wounded. Winter was arriving, and soldiers were still equipped with summer uniforms. Frostbite, dysentery, and exhaustion. The Sixth Army's logistical base at Gumrak and Pitomnik airfields could not maintain the flow of food, ammunition, and fuel. Supply convoys were ambushed or stuck in muddy roads. The average daily ration for frontline troops dropped to under 200 calories by early November. To address the growing crisis, Paulus requested permission to temporarily halt offensive operations and consolidate defenses. Hitler refused. He insisted that victory was within reach and that the Soviets were nearly finished. In reality, the Red Army was preparing to strike. The German command had dangerously underestimated Soviet operational planning and strategic patience. Soviet intelligence, backed by extensive reconnaissance and partisan activity behind enemy lines, provided detailed maps of Axis positions. The stage was now set for Operation Uranus, the massive double envelopment designed to encircle the German Sixth Army and trap it within the ruins of Stalingrad. As German and Soviet units continued to bleed each other dry in the shattered streets, factories, and ruins of the city, neither side knew that the character of the battle was about to change decisively. What had so far been a brutal attritional struggle would soon become a siege, a collapse, and a death sentence for one of the most powerful armies the Wehrmacht had ever fielded. The decision-makers in Berlin and Moscow were already shifting their focus toward the next phase, one that would redefine the Eastern Front for the remainder of the war. On November 19, 1942, at precisely 07:30 Moscow time, the Red Army initiated Operation Uranus with a massive artillery barrage across the northern flank of the German Sixth Army. The attack was led by the Southwestern Front under General Nicolae Vatutin and targeted the Romanian Third Army, which had been deployed to guard the exposed northern approaches to Stalingrad. Within hours, the Soviet 5th Tank Army and 21st Army had breached the Axis lines across a 50-kilometer front. Romanian defenses collapsed rapidly. Poorly equipped and lacking anti-tank weapons, their infantry formations could not halt Soviet T-34s or mechanized infantry. The next day, November 20th, the Stalingrad front under General Andrei Yeryomenko launched the southern pincer, attacking the Romanian 4th Army Corps along the Don Bend. The Soviet 51st and 57th Armies advanced swiftly, bypassing or overwhelming Axis strongpoints. Within 48 hours, both flanks of the German Sixth Army had been penetrated, and Soviet mechanized spearheads were racing toward Kalak-on-Don, a key logistical node located over 100 kilometers west of the city. By November 23rd, Soviet armored columns from the north and south met near the town of Sovetski, completing the encirclement. In just 4 days, approximately 290,000 Axis troops, including the German Sixth Army, parts of the 4th Panzer Army, and remnants of Romanian, Croatian, and Hungarian units, were trapped inside a pocket centered on Stalingrad. The Kessel, or cauldron as German commanders began to call it, spanned roughly 50 kilometers from west to east and 40 kilometers from north to south. German High Command in Berlin, as well as in the theater under Field Marshal von Manstein, was initially slow to recognize the magnitude of the disaster. Hitler issued strict orders that the Sixth Army was to remain in place and hold its ground. He promised that the Luftwaffe would resupply the trapped forces by air until a relief operation could be organized. However, Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring had significantly overestimated the airlift's feasibility. The required daily tonnage to sustain the encircled force was estimated at 500 tons. In reality, the Luftwaffe was only capable of delivering an average of 90 to 120 tons per day, and that only in favorable conditions. The two primary airfields inside the pocket, Pitomnik and Gumrak, were soon under constant Soviet artillery fire and subject to frequent air raids. Many transports were shot down before landing or destroyed on the ground. Ground crews operated under relentless shelling. Critical shortages in aviation fuel, spare parts, and winter clothing worsened the situation. German medical units were overwhelmed. Wounded soldiers filled basements, train cars, and makeshift shelters, often without morphine, bandages, or heat. Inside the Kessel, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The city's already devastated infrastructure could not support the encircled force. Rations were cut to subsistence levels. Bread was often made with sawdust or straw to stretch supplies. Horses were slaughtered. Their meat frostbite cases rose exponentially as temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Soldiers dug trenches through frozen rubble, using salvaged doors and bricks as shelter. Ammunition was hoarded and rationed. Artillery units fired sparingly. Tank crews cannibalized wrecks for parts. Despite the worsening conditions, Hitler continued to order Paulus to hold Stalingrad at all costs. On December 12, 1942, Field Marshal von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, a relief attempt using the newly formed Army Group Dawn. The German 4th Panzer Army advanced from the southwest and reached as close as 48 kilometers to the Kessel's southern edge. However, Paulus was never authorized to attempt a breakout. Lacking fuel, coordination, and clarity of command, the Sixth Army remained static. Soviet resistance along the relief corridor, particularly from the 2nd Guards Army, was intense. By December 23, Winter Storm was the failure of the relief operation sealed the Sixth Army's fate. Soviet forces launched Operation Little Saturn on December 16, targeting the Italian Eighth Army to the northwest. Within a week, entire Italian corps were overrun, and the Axis northern flank collapsed. The Soviet advance threatened not only the Kessel, but also the rear of Army Group A in the Caucasus. Hitler reluctantly authorized a withdrawal from the Caucasus, marking the first major German strategic retreat on the Eastern Front. By early January 1943, Soviet artillery had fully encircled the pocket and began systematically compressing it. Day and night, barrages fell on German positions. Soviet infantry attacks were preceded by waves of rockets, mortars, and howitzer fire. The Kessel shrank with each passing day. Communications between encircled units became sporadic. German command posts were relocated into cellars. The Luftwaffe attempted to deliver supplies by parachute, but containers often landed in Soviet-controlled zones. Food stocks were exhausted. Some German units began executing their own horses for survival. Reports of cannibalism among isolated soldiers began to appear in both German and Soviet intelligence intercepts. Medical collapse was widespread. At Gumrock, the last operational airstrip, thousands of wounded lay exposed to the elements, waiting for evacuation that never came. When the airfield finally fell on January 22nd, all hopes of air resupply or escape ended. Paulus requested permission to surrender. Hitler refused. On January 30th, he promoted Paulus to field marshal, reminding him that no German officer of that rank had ever been captured alive. The implication was clear. On January 31st, Soviet forces under General Rokossovsky breached the southern sector of the pocket and reached the headquarters of the Sixth Army. Paulus surrendered without resistance, along with approximately 91,000 surviving troops. Of these, only around 5,000 would eventually return to Germany after the war. The rest perished in Soviet captivity, killed by disease, exhaustion, or execution. The fall of Stalingrad was not merely a tactical or operational loss. It represented a seismic rupture in the German war effort. For the first time, an entire German field army had been destroyed in combat. Hitler's prestige, which had peaked during the rapid victories of 1940 to 1941, suffered a major blow. Soviet morale, both civilian and military, surged. The Red Army had demonstrated not only the capacity to defend, but to plan, coordinate, and execute massive encirclement operations. As news of the surrender reached Berlin, Nazi propaganda attempted to downplay its significance, labeling it a heroic sacrifice and focusing on the brutal weather conditions. But inside the Führerbunker and across the Wehrmacht command structure, the implications were undeniable. A turning point had been reached. The German advance was halted, and from this moment onward, the Red Army would begin its long push westward. The Battle of Stalingrad had ended, but its shadow would stretch across the remainder of the war. The destruction of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad in early February 1943 initiated a series of cascading consequences across the entire Eastern Front. As Soviet units mopped up isolated pockets of resistance among the ruins, the strategic and operational landscape of the war began to shift decisively. The Wehrmacht had lost over 250,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in the Stalingrad pocket. These figures did not include the casualties suffered by Romania, Italy, and Hungary, whose combined losses on the flanks exceeded 100,000. The Soviet Union, too, paid a steep price. Official estimates recorded over 1.1 million Soviet casualties, including approximately 478,000 killed or missing and another 650,000 wounded during the 5-month campaign. The immediate military consequences were profound. The German line across southern Russia was now fractured. Army Group A, previously deployed deep into the Caucasus with nearly 800,000 troops, was forced to begin a rapid and chaotic withdrawal northward to avoid being cut off by Soviet forces advancing from the Stalingrad region. This retreat marked a reversal of Germany's southern ambitions and signaled the collapse of Hitler's Caucasus strategy. The oil fields of Baku, once seen as the key to German strategic self-sufficiency, were now permanently out of reach. As Soviet forces advanced westward, they launched a series of follow-up offensives in the spring of 1943. Operation Gallop and Operation Star, both launched in February, aimed to exploit the weakened German positions along the Donbass and Kharkov sectors. Soviet forces recaptured key cities, including Kursk and Belgorod. However, These gains soon exceeded Soviet logistical capabilities. Supply lines became overstretched, fuel shortages slowed armored advances, and exhausted infantry formations encountered renewed German resistance. Despite its defeat at Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht remained capable of delivering concentrated counterblows. Under the command of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, German forces conducted a skillful counteroffensive in March 1943. Utilizing the elite SS Panzer Corps and the Grossdeutschland Division, German forces recaptured Kharkov after a series of mobile battles. The Third Battle of Kharkov inflicted heavy casualties on Soviet formations and stabilized the southern front temporarily. However, this was no longer a war of German initiative. The strategic balance had shifted irreversibly in the Soviets' favor. Politically, the fall of Stalingrad shook the foundations of Nazi control both at home and abroad. Within Germany, public confidence was shaken by the acknowledgement that an entire field army had been lost. Though Goebbels attempted to rally the populace through his infamous total war speech in the Berlin Sportpalast on February 18th, the mood had changed. Air raid shelters in German cities were filled with whispers of doubt, and letters intercepted by the Gestapo revealed rising skepticism among soldiers' families. Hitler's aura of infallibility was tarnished. Within the Axis alliance, the collapse of the Romanian and Italian flanks exposed deep flaws in German coalition warfare. Both nations had suffered catastrophic losses at Stalingrad and in the surrounding operations. Italy, already reeling from defeats in North Africa, began considering avenues for exit. Romania, whose oil resources were vital to the German war machine, grew increasingly cautious. Hungarian commanders expressed open frustration at German high command decisions, especially over the deployment of underprepared divisions in exposed positions. The weakening of Axis cohesion would have long-term consequences, particularly as the Soviets began to apply political pressure to exploit nationalist tensions within occupied Europe. The Red Army, meanwhile, drew vital operational lessons from the Stalingrad campaign. The coordination between fronts, the use of maskirovka, military deception, and the synchronization of armor, artillery. While Soviet casualties remained high, the performance of newly created tank armies and guards units showed significant improvement. Confidence among commanders grew. Figures such as Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Vatutin, and Vasilevsky had emerged as leaders capable of handling large-scale, multi-front operations. Importantly, the Soviet Union now knew that the Wehrmacht could be beaten, not just checked or delayed, but decisively destroyed. The morale impact across the Soviet Union was profound. The victory at Stalingrad was hailed not just as a military triumph, but as a vindication of Soviet ideology and national resilience. Medals were awarded in mass ceremonies, and newspapers printed heroic accounts of the defenders. The city itself was awarded the title Hero City, and Chuikov's 62nd Army became a symbol of national pride. Soviet propaganda emphasized the multinational nature of its victory, highlighting the participation of soldiers from across the Union, from Ukraine to Central Asia to Siberia, framing the struggle as a united stand against foreign invaders. At the same time, Stalin used the victory to tighten his internal control. The political authority of the Stavka grew, and the Red Army's success emboldened party organs to intensify control over occupied and liberated territories. Deportations of ethnic minorities accused of collaboration increased. Internal purges resumed quietly, particularly against officers accused of cowardice or hesitation during the campaign. Stalingrad thus became both a symbol of resistance and a tool of state consolidation. Internationally, the battle had ripple effects beyond the Eastern Front. In London and Washington, Stalingrad was viewed as a critical turning point. Allied leaders, including Churchill and Roosevelt, praised the Soviet effort and began discussing the feasibility of a post-war balance of power that would include a strong USSR. The Tehran Conference, held later in 1943, reflected a new recognition of Soviet military capacity. Although the Western Allies continued to delay opening a second front in France, supplies through the Arctic convoys and the Persian corridor increased. American Lend-Lease shipments of trucks, fuel, and raw materials intensified, sustaining Soviet logistical operations for future offensives. Stalingrad also altered the psychological dynamic of the war. In occupied Europe, resistance groups saw the German defeat as proof that the Reich was not invincible. In Paris, Prague, and Warsaw, underground newspapers reprinted news of the surrender. Among Wehrmacht soldiers, morale dipped. Letters home described hopelessness, and some German officers began to express doubts in their private writings about the feasibility of ultimate victory. The prestige of the German military, once viewed as tactically and technologically superior, was now openly questioned. The battle did not end the war, but it marked a definitive end to Germany's ability to dominate the Eastern Front unchallenged. The attritional cost of the campaign, the loss of irreplaceable manpower and equipment, and the psychological shock of defeat would have enduring consequences. For the remainder of the war, the Wehrmacht would be largely on the defensive in the East, reacting to Soviet initiatives rather than dictating their own. The path from the Volga to Berlin would take another 2.5 years, but the tide had turned. The Eastern Front, once a scene of sweeping German victories, was now the crucible, and at the center of that shift stood the shattered ruins of a city that no longer resembled its pre-war self. Stalingrad, the graveyard of a German army, and the birthplace of Soviet ascendancy. By the late summer of 1942, as the German Sixth Army was closing in on Stalingrad, the tempo of operations reached an intensity not yet seen in the war. What had begun as a strategic push toward the Volga evolved into one of the largest urban combat engagements in military history. The peak of the campaign was not defined by a single battle, but by a relentless succession of interconnected operations across shattered city blocks, industrial plants, and riverbanks. These engagements, though localized, bore strategic weight. Each ruined building captured or held represented not just ground gained or lost, but shifts in operational. German forces, notably the 71st, 76th, and 295th Infantry Divisions, along with units from the 24th Panzer Division and elements of elite pioneer battalions, launched multiple assaults into the city's northern and central districts. Their objectives were clear: secure the riverbanks, cut off Soviet reinforcement routes, and eliminate resistance in key industrial zones. However, every German advance encountered fanatical resistance. Soviet defenders, especially the 62nd Army under General Vasily Chuikov, transformed every structure into a potential strong point. The largest clashes centered around three key industrial zones in the northern part of the city: the Red October Steelworks, the Barakati Gun Factory, and the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory. Each of these complexes was several square kilometers in size, with reinforced concrete buildings, underground storage facilities, and rail yards, all of which were fortified and manned by Soviet infantry, sappers, artillery observers, and snipers. German assaults in late September and early October 1942, supported by Stuka dive bombers and artillery regiments, managed to push into these factories but failed to dislodge the Soviet defenders entirely. Fighting took place inside warehouses, boiler rooms, and loading bays. Control of specific rooms or even staircases shifted daily. Mamayev Kurgan, a strategically important hill overlooking central Stalingrad and the Volga crossings, became another focal point. Between September and December, Mamayev Kurgan changed hands multiple times. Soviet and German artillery pulverized the hill repeatedly. The soil became so saturated with shell fragments and human remains that vegetation did not regrow for years. German attempts to dominate the hill to improve observation over Soviet positions were constantly thwarted by counterattacks, many of them conducted at night or during blizzards to minimize German air support. Urban combat conditions at the peak of the battle were unlike anything seen before. The density of fighting meant that traditional front lines dissolved. Units operated in small platoons or even squads, often cut off from higher command for hours or days. Communications relied on messengers, signal flags, or captured enemy radios. Artillery fire was requested for buildings less than 50 meters away. Both sides used sewers and tunnels for movement. German soldiers referred to the battlefield as the Rattenkrieg, Rat War, a term reflecting the claustrophobic, chaotic, and deadly nature of the environment. Soviet tactics increasingly favored close-in fighting, where German firepower advantages, especially from tanks and aircraft, were nullified. Soviet infantry stayed within 50-100 meters of German positions, forcing the attackers to engage in bayonet and grenade combat, which slowed advances and exhausted units. Sniper activity was pervasive. The most famous Soviet sniper, Vasily Zaitsev, reportedly killed over 200 enemy soldiers during the peak months of the battle, operating in teams with spotters and decoys. German snipers responded with their own counter teams, but the environment favored defenders. Meanwhile, the logistical burden on both sides escalated. For the Germans, supply lines stretched back to railheads near Rostov, then moved forward by truck convoys and horse-drawn carts. By October, mud from autumn rains and constant Soviet interdiction made resupply difficult. Ammunition and fuel had to be prioritized, and some German frontline units received only a fraction of their daily requirements. Soviet engineers and sailors braved constant German bombardment to ferry reinforcements, ammunition, and food across from the eastern bank. In addition to combat operations, the psychological strain on troops peaked. German soldiers, many of whom had previously fought in open terrain across Poland and France, were ill-prepared for prolonged urban warfare. Letters home described the relentless shelling, the smell of decaying bodies, and the sense of isolation. Units had to rotate through the front every few days, yet even rear areas within the city were within Soviet mortar range. Similarly, Soviet troops faced near-total exhaustion. Many had arrived without proper winter gear or rations. Wounded men continued to fight. NKVD detachments enforced discipline, but many soldiers no longer needed coercion. The survival of their comrades and the fate of the city had become personal. Civilian suffering. Tens of thousands of residents had failed to evacuate before the city was surrounded. Many took shelter in basements and cellars, often alongside Soviet troops. Civilians performed essential support tasks: cooking, carrying ammunition, digging trenches. Disease spread rapidly, with outbreaks of typhus and dysentery. Winter temperatures dropped below -30°C in November and December. Starvation became widespread. Despite these conditions, reports of civilians helping in defense persisted. Some joined militia units. Others served as scouts or messengers. Both German and Soviet high commands recognized the centrality of Stalingrad's fate. Hitler issued multiple orders forbidding any withdrawal. German divisions were to hold their gains regardless of casualties. Reinforcements from Army Group B, including the 305th and 389th Infantry Divisions, were sent into the city, suffering heavy losses in transit, or entire rifle divisions crossed the Volga under fire to reinforce positions that had often ceased to exist by the time they arrived. Soviet tank brigades fought dismounted. Artillery was dragged into cellars and fired from enclosed positions. As the calendar turned to November, German forces controlled roughly 90% of the city's west bank. Yet the Soviets still held a sliver of territory along the river. Crucially, these positions allowed the Red Army to maintain ferry routes and reinforcement points. The German command believed that complete victory was within reach, and final assaults were planned to clear out remaining Soviet resistance. But the cost had already become unsustainable. Entire battalions had been wiped out. Ammunition shortage. Soviet forces rotated in an even larger number, ensuring a near-constant flow of replacements. Artillery pieces fired tens of thousands of shells per day. Infantry life expectancy in the frontline sections of the city was measured in days. Still, neither side withdrew. The peak of the Stalingrad campaign represented the culmination of total war in its most destructive form. Urban terrain, political pressure, and military doctrine had converged to create a battle where every meter of ground extracted a devastating cost. Though the city remained contested, the battle's shape was beginning to bend. On the periphery, Soviet forces were gathering strength for a new phase, one not focused on street-to-street combat, but on cutting off the entire German force from the outside world. The siege that would follow would be built on the human and material exhaustion that reached its peak in the final weeks of 1942. As the front lines within Stalingrad solidified into static pockets of urban resistance, the wider region surrounding the city became a testing ground for military adaptation under conditions of extreme deprivation. Both the German and Soviet commands were forced to reevaluate their methods of warfare, logistically, tactically, and psychologically. In the absence of mobility and strategic initiative, survival increasingly depended on the ability to resist collapse through improvisation, resource conservation, and sheer resilience. This period marked a transition from offensive operations to a grind-in war of endurance. For the encircled German Sixth Army, the reality of isolation set in by mid-November 1942. The Luftwaffe, despite Göring's promises, could not meet the daily supply requirements of the 250,000 troops trapped in the Kessel. Paulus's staff reported that a minimum of 500 tons of supplies per day were needed to maintain minimal combat effectiveness. During most of December, deliveries ranged between 70 and 110 tons per day, less than a quarter of the requirement. On some days, no supplies arrived at all due to weather or Soviet fighter activity. The number of available Junkers Ju-52 transports was too small and replacements too slow. Many aircraft were lost in the attempt. This logistical shortfall forced German units to adapt drastically. Standard rations were abandoned in favor of field-foraged food, which included flour mixed with sawdust, horse meat, and even boiled leather from gear and harnesses. Fuel was reserved for emergency troop movements and priority artillery units. Ammunition was rationed to the point where platoons were ordered to hold fire unless under direct attack. Soldiers disassembled unexploded Soviet shells to repurpose them. In some cases, units developed makeshift mortars or repurposed aircraft machine guns for ground defense. Wounded soldiers were often left untreated due to the collapse of the field hospital system. German engineers, accustomed to building bridges and bunkers, now focused on constructing underground shelters out of rubble and scrap. Weapons maintenance became a critical survival skill, as low temperatures caused oil to freeze and firing mechanisms to jam. German radios operated intermittently due to the cold, so couriers and signal flags were reintroduced. Frostbite cases multiplied. By early January, over 30,000 German troops were classified as non-combat capable due to exposure-related injuries. Yet even in these conditions, German units continued to fight. They established internal rotation systems, moving troops from the most exposed sectors to rear areas for rest, even if rear was only 300 meters away. Psychological reinforcement was achieved through slogans, survival stories, and the distribution. Desertions were rare, but not unheard of. Suicide rates increased. German officers began reporting signs of fatalism among their men. On the Soviet side, adaptation took a different form. The Red Army, though no longer under siege, was still operating under immense strain. Supply lines across the Volga remained dangerous. Barges and ferries came under daily German artillery fire, and frozen river surfaces created both opportunities and hazards for reinforcement movements. Soviet engineers built pontoon bridges and ice tracks, but these were targeted frequently. Despite this, the Red Army ensured a continuous influx of personnel and materiel. Adaptation for Soviet units also involved the integration of irregular forces. Partisan groups in the rear harassed German logistics and gathered intelligence. Local militia units, including factory workers and civilians, were merged into frontline formations. Female personnel, the psychological conditioning of troops, emphasized ideological conviction, the defense of the motherland, and the shame of surrender. Propaganda units distributed leaflets to reinforce resolve and denigrate German soldiers as invaders and plunderers. Inside the city, Soviet troops began employing defense in depth, even within buildings. Floors and basements were layered with overlapping fields of fire. Sappers mined staircases and entryways, sometimes detonating them only after allowing German units to enter fully. Observation posts were set up in attics, with snipers coordinated via wired communication. Soviet artillery observers occupied rooftops and directed fire with increasing accuracy, aided by improved coordination with rear batteries across the river. One notable development was the use of night operations. The Soviets began launching small-scale attacks at dusk and during snowstorms, times when German aircraft and artillery were least effective. These actions aimed less at territorial gain than at exhausting German units and disrupting their rest cycles. Soviet infantry would probe German lines, draw in return fire to reveal enemy positions, then withdraw. Such tactics sowed confusion and fatigue among German defenders and allowed the Red Army to refine its targeting. Resource management also became a distinguishing factor. Soviet units had greater access to winter clothing, provided by factories in the Urals and Siberia. Supply dumps were established behind the lines and concealed with snow or camouflage. Mobile kitchens moved with units, offering hot meals even under fire. Political officers ensured unit cohesion, but discipline was increasingly maintained by mutual dependency and battlefield trust. Troops who survived the October-November fighting were now hardened, experienced, and better prepared for what lay ahead. German troops mounted salvaged Soviet anti-tank guns onto destroyed tank chassis to create mobile firing platforms. Soviet tank crews, often operating without radio communication, used colored flags for signaling. Artillery units learned to fire indirectly based on auditory corrections, listening for echoes and reverberation in ruined buildings to adjust fire. Medical personnel used captured supplies when Soviet stocks ran low. Even war dogs were deployed, trained to carry messages or detect mines. Psychologically, the Red Army displayed increasing resilience. Where once panic had spread quickly in the face of German armored breakthroughs, now Soviet soldiers were emboldened by the enemy's visible exhaustion. Prisoners reported that Germans no longer advanced with confidence and that orders were being issued to hold at all costs. The balance had shifted. Initiative was returning to Soviet hands. Civilian adaptation during this phase deserves separate attention. While most of the pre-war population had either fled or perished, several thousand civilians remained in the city. These individuals organized themselves into support cells. They cooked for soldiers, distributed warm clothing, and carried ammunition. In many cases, civilians acted as de facto medics or burial details. Women and elderly residents learned to operate field stoves and forage for food in the ruins. Children acted as messengers and scouts. Their knowledge of the city's layout, alleyways, basements, and tunnels became invaluable. By mid-January 1943, these adaptations, improvised logistics, defensive ingenuity, and psychological resilience defined the new character of the Battle of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army was no longer an offensive force. It had become a besieged entity, fighting not for victory, but for survival. The Soviets, in turn, no longer viewed the battle as a desperate defense, but as an opportunity to destroy a key element of the enemy's military power. The upcoming Soviet assault would not simply seek to win the city, but to erase an entire German army from the field. The time for static resistance was ending. The final collapse was approaching. The decisive turning point of the Battle of Stalingrad arrived not through a single dramatic event, but through a gradual and methodical constriction of the German Sixth Army by Soviet forces executing a well-coordinated series of offensives. Operation Uranus had successfully encircled the German position, but it was Operation Ring, launched on January 10, 1943, that would bring about the final collapse. By early January, the Kessel had shrunk dramatically. German positions within the city had been compressed into a few disconnected pockets. The westernmost areas around the Potomac and Gumrak airfields were still under Axis control, but daily artillery barrages and continuous ground assaults made them unusable. Gumrak, the last operational airfield within the pocket, fell on January 22. With its loss, the Luftwaffe ceased all evacuation flights, and 6th Army was now completely cut off. No reinforcements, no supplies, no escape. On January 10th, the Soviet Don Front under General Konstantin Rokossovsky initiated Operation Ring with an artillery barrage involving over 7,000 guns, mortars, and rocket launchers. The initial bombardment lasted more than an hour, striking with calculated precision against weakened German defensive lines. Soviet infantry and armor followed in waves. The goal was no longer merely to reduce the pocket, it was to annihilate their intelligence, supplied by captured documents, aerial reconnaissance, and radio intercepts, allowed them to map out German positions in great detail. They identified ammunition stockpiles, command posts, and weak points in the German lines. Units of the 65th, 21st, and 24th Soviet armies advanced simultaneously from north and west, exploiting the worn-down state of German units and the disintegration of their logistical support. German resistance, though still coordinated in some sectors, was collapsing. Many formations, such as the 44th and 76th Infantry Divisions, were down to battalion strength. Officers had lost contact with higher command. In several areas, German troops fell back without orders, abandoning positions that had once been defended at great cost. Units reorganized into ad hoc Kampfgruppen, battle groups, comprised of whatever personnel and equipment remained. Machine gun nests were relocated to new defensive lines, built from rubble and frozen sandbags. Street-by-street fighting resumed, but the momentum had shifted decisively in Soviet favor. The central and southern parts of the city witnessed some of the bloodiest clashes. Soviet troops encountered pockets of fanatical resistance in the basements of apartment buildings and within sewer systems. German sappers attempted to delay advances with improvised explosives and booby traps. Mortars were fired at point-blank range. Soviet infantry used flamethrowers, grenades, and close combat weapons to clear out each room. Buildings were taken only after days of combat, and often at the cost of dozens of lives. Despite the deteriorating situation, Hitler remained adamant that Paulus not surrender. On January 30, 1943, Hitler promoted General Friedrich Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. The message was clear. No German field marshal had ever been taken alive. He was expected to either fight to the last man but Paulus, aware of the hopelessness of his position and facing the imminent collapse of organized resistance, made no move toward suicide. By this time, the 6th Army's situation was critical. Ammunition was nearly gone. Artillery shells were counted individually. Many soldiers had no working weapons. Wounded men froze in unheated cellars. Rations had been reduced to 50 grams of bread per day, supplemented by soup made from boiled bones or dead horses. Morale was shattered. Soldiers wandered aimlessly. Units disintegrated under pressure. Soviet leaflets offering honorable surrender were circulated, and while German officers attempted to maintain discipline, the inevitability of defeat was apparent. On January 31st, Soviet forces reached the southern sector of the German command zone. Red Army soldiers surrounded the basement headquarters of the Sixth Army in the Univermag department store. There, Paulus and his remaining staff officers were taken into custody without a fight. Simultaneously, several isolated German regiments in the southern pocket began surrendering en masse. The final radio message from the Sixth Army, sent that morning, was a brief acknowledgement that the Russians are at the door. However, not all resistance ceased with Paulus's capture. In the northern sector of the Kessel, remnants of the 18th Corps under General Karl Strecker continued to fight until February 2nd. These formations, cut off from communication and unaware of Paulus's surrender, held their positions in the hope of last-minute orders. When Soviet envoys approached under white flags, they were initially fired upon. Only after several hours of negotiation and direct observation of Paulus's written orders did Strecker agree to capitulate. With the formal surrender of the last German pockets on February 2nd, the Battle of Stalingrad officially ended. Of the approximately 290,000 Axis personnel originally trapped inside the pocket, around 91,000 were taken prisoner. This included nearly 2,500 officers, 24 generals, and hundreds of support staff. The conditions of surrender were dire. Many of the captives were suffering from typhus, dysentery, frostbite, or starvation. Soviet records indicate that as many as 27,000 prisoners died within the first few weeks due to exposure and untreated injuries. The prisoners were marched to camps hundreds of kilometers away in the interior of the Soviet Union. Many collapsed along the route. Others were loaded onto overcrowded rail cars without food or sanitation. Of the 91,000 taken prisoner, only around 5,000 would ever return to Germany, most after the war had ended in the 1950s. The rest perished in captivity, a grim testament to the human cost of the campaign. For the Soviet Union, the encirclement and elimination of the German Sixth Army was a triumph of coordination, endurance, and strategic planning. It demonstrated that the Red Army could not only resist German advances, but deliver fatal blows to major enemy formations. The successful execution of multiple fronts, integration of reserves, and synchronized logistical efforts marked a new level of operational maturity for Soviet command. The turning point at Stalingrad was not just military, it was psychological. It shattered the myth of German invincibility. It ended the aura of Wehrmacht supremacy that had defined the first years of the war. Hitler's leadership was now openly questioned within military circles, though dissent remained internalized. Soviet confidence surged. The victory laid the groundwork for subsequent offensives that would push what had begun as a campaign to secure resources and strategic positioning on the Volga had ended with the largest capitulation in German military history. The consequences would resonate far beyond the rubble of the city, shaping not only the remainder of the war, but the political and military balance of the post-war world. Stalingrad was no longer merely a battlefield. It was now a symbol of death, endurance, and a fundamental shift in the tide of global conflict. The aftermath of the Battle of Stalingrad unfolded as a humanitarian disaster, a logistical nightmare, and a political watershed. With the surrender of the German Sixth Army completed by February 2, 1943, Soviet forces moved quickly to secure the ruins of the city and begin the processing of tens of thousands of Axis prisoners. While combat operations, the condition of the German prisoners was catastrophic. According to Soviet records and eyewitness reports, over half of the 91,000 captured soldiers were either wounded or suffering from diseases such as typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia. Most were emaciated, with many weighing under 45 kilograms. Uniforms were torn and inadequate for winter conditions. Wounded soldiers had often been untreated for weeks. Soviet medical units, themselves operating under supply constraints, attempted to stabilize the worst cases, but were quickly overwhelmed. Facilities were makeshift, converted buildings, tents, or outdoor collection points. Medical prioritization focused on Soviet troops and civilians, leaving prisoners to survive as best they could. Evacuation began almost immediately. Columns of prisoners were marched from Stalingrad to collection points outside the city, often on foot, through snow and sub-zero temperatures. Many collapsed and died along the route. Those who fell behind were frequently left behind or shot. Others were loaded onto open train wagons for transport to camps in the Soviet interior: Tambov, Sverdlovsk, Karaganda, and others. Journey durations ranged from several days to over 2 weeks. Starvation, exposure, and overcrowding turned these journeys into death sentences for thousands. Soviet records suggest that as many as 27,000 prisoners perished during evacuation and initial camp intake. The logistical demands of transporting and housing so many captives in winter were immense. The Soviet NKVD, responsible for prisoner administration, was unprepared for such a sudden influx. Camps lacked adequate shelter, medical staff, or food stocks. Typhus spread rapidly. Mass graves were dug outside camp perimeters. Survivor accounts describe sleeping outdoors in snow, receiving no food for days, and witnessing daily deaths from cold or disease. While some officers and technical specialists were afforded slightly better conditions for interrogation or labor purposes, the vast majority of the Sixth Army's rank and file faced near total neglect. Only around 5,000 of the original prisoners would survive to return to Germany, many after 10 or more years in captivity. Those who did return in the 1950s carried the physical and psychological scars of their internment. Some were unable to speak about their experiences for years. Others were treated with suspicion by the East German regime, or distanced by families who had believed them dead. The human cost of the surrender extended far beyond the battlefield. It continued in silence across decades. On the Soviet side, the aftermath of Stalingrad marked the beginning of a new phase in the war. Morale soared. For the first time, Soviet citizens had tangible proof that the tide had turned. Newspapers carried triumphant headlines, and mass rallies were held in Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad itself. Chuikov's 62nd Army was renamed the 8th Guards Army, and numerous officers were promoted. Decorations were awarded in unprecedented numbers. The term Stalingrad became a rallying cry across Soviet propaganda, symbolizing resilience, patriotism, and ideological superiority. Yet the devastation within the city was nearly total. Civilian infrastructure no longer existed. Over 40,000 civilians had died in the initial August bombing raids alone. The subsequent siege, shelling, and street fighting had killed tens of thousands more. By the end of the battle, fewer than 10,000 civilians remained in Stalingrad, most of them elderly, women, or children living in cellars and ruins. Emergency relief operations were launched by Soviet authorities, with Red Army engineers. Field kitchens were set up, temporary hospitals constructed, and debris clearing teams deployed. The Soviet government also began planning for the reconstruction of the city. Stalingrad was designated a hero city, and blueprints for post-war urban renewal were drafted even before the front had shifted. Rubble was repurposed into building materials. New housing units were assembled from prefabricated parts. Over the next decade, the city would become a showcase of Soviet resilience and architectural modernism, though it would never fully return to its pre-war status. Militarily, the victory at Stalingrad allowed the Red Army to seize the strategic initiative across the southern front. In the months following the battle, Soviet forces launched a series of offensives aimed at pushing German troops out of the Donbass region and the Kharkov area. Though some of these efforts, such as Operation Star and Operation Gallop, were eventually halted by German counterattacks, the psychological advantage now lay with the Red Army. Wehrmacht commanders recognized that no longer could they dictate the terms of battle without facing the risk of encirclement and strategic defeat. The implications for the German war effort were grave. The loss of the Sixth Army meant more than just manpower. It represented a fundamental rupture in Germany's Eastern campaign. Not only had an entire army been destroyed, but its supporting arms, including armor, artillery, and logistical support, were gone. Replacing these forces was beyond the Reich's capacity. The German command system, over-reliant on Hitler's centralized decision-making, now faced a credibility crisis. While promotions and awards were given to surviving officers to maintain morale, the operational command had lost its edge. In Berlin, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels delivered the Total War speech on February 18, 1943, rallying citizens to redouble their efforts. But the atmosphere in Germany had changed. Air raids were becoming more frequent. Rationing intensified. Confidence eroded. Letters from the front increasingly reflected disillusionment, not just with command decisions, but with the war's purpose. Soldiers who had survived the Caucasus retreat, or who were now stationed in Ukraine and Belarus, understood that a major shift had occurred. The days of rapid advances and swift victories were over. For the Axis allies, Italy, Romania, and Hungary, the implications were equally severe. All three had contributed troops to the Stalingrad campaign, and all had suffered debilitating losses. Italian forces, especially the Eighth Army along the Don, had been shattered by Soviet offensives in December and January. The political repercussions in Rome were immediate. Mussolini's government came under increased internal pressure, and by July 1943, Italy would fall to Allied invasion and internal revolt. Romania and Hungary began reconsidering their roles in the alliance, and both engaged in secret diplomatic outreach to the Western Allies in the following months. In occupied territories, news of the German defeat sparked hope among resistance groups. Partisan activity increased across Eastern Europe. In Yugoslavia, Belarus, and Ukraine, sabotage operations and ambushes became more frequent. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad was not just a battlefield event, it was a signal. It demonstrated that Germany could be beaten and that occupation was not permanent. The broader international response was also significant. In Britain and the United States, the victory was celebrated as a key turning point. Allied leaders acknowledged Soviet contributions publicly and began coordinating more closely with the USSR through the Combined Chiefs of Staff and later the Tehran Conference. The Western Allies, long hesitant to launch a second front, now faced increased pressure to do so. The Soviet Union had demonstrated both capability and endurance, and expected reciprocity. Ultimately, the immediate aftermath of Stalingrad revealed a fundamental truth. The war had entered a new phase. The Wehrmacht's operational superiority had been broken. The Red Army had become a force capable not only of defense, but of complex, large-scale offensive operations. And the Soviet state, though battered, had withstood the worst the Reich could throw at it. Stalingrad was no longer simply a name on a map. It had become a monument to suffering, adaptation, and irreversible change. The ruins of the city marked the border between two eras of the war. And in that bleak winter of 1943, the world took notice. In the years following the Second World War, the Battle of Stalingrad assumed a central position in the collective memory of the conflict. As one of the most destructive and consequential battles in modern history, it came to represent a turning point not only in the Eastern Front, but in the global trajectory of the war. Its legacy extended across military doctrine, political narratives, cultural commemoration, and historical debate, shaping the identities of both victors and vanquished for generations to come. From the Soviet perspective, Stalingrad was elevated to near mythical status. The defense of the city was framed as a triumph of socialist patriotism, the ultimate proof of the superiority of Soviet ideology and leadership. Official war history. The city itself was rebuilt not simply as a functioning urban center, but as a living monument. In 1945, Stalingrad was among the first cities to receive the title Hero City of the Soviet Union, and its reconstruction was prioritized in the first post-war 5-year plan. The most iconic memorial project, Mamiev Kurgan's colossal The Motherland Calls statue, was erected in 1967, towering over the city at 85 meters and symbolizing the spirit of national defense. Around it were the graves of thousands of fallen soldiers and symbolic architectural elements chronicling the battle. Museums, eternal flames, and military parades became fixtures of post-war Soviet identity. Stalingrad was not simply a victory. It was a founding. Soviet media often featured their recollections during anniversaries. Even in post-Soviet Russia, the memory of Stalingrad retained its weight. Though the city was renamed Volgograd in 1961 during de-Stalinization, proposals have periodically emerged to restore its wartime name, especially around anniversaries or in political campaigns evoking national pride. In the German context, Stalingrad became a symbol of both tragedy and transformation. Immediately after the war, public discourse largely avoided direct engagement with the events at Stalingrad. The magnitude of the defeat and the fate of tens of thousands of missing soldiers was too painful to confront openly. It was not until the 1950s and 1960s, as surviving prisoners began returning from Soviet captivity, that memoirs and personal accounts appeared. These narratives often emphasized suffering, endurance, and betrayal by political leadership, particularly Hitler's refusal to permit a breakout or surrender. Books such as Heinz Schröter's Stalingrad, 1959, and Siegfried Knappe's Soldat helped shape West German understanding of the battle as a tragic loss, divorced from broader questions of culpability. In East Germany, under Soviet influence, the official narrative condemned Nazi militarism and elevated the Red Army's role in liberating the East. Former German officers, such as General Friedrich Paulus, who chose to collaborate with Soviet authorities after his capture, were used in propaganda broadcasts to denounce the Nazi regime and call for peace. In modern Germany, Stalingrad is taught as part of the broader reckoning with the crimes and failures of the Nazi era. Memorials focus on the human cost of the war, the dangers of totalitarianism, and the importance of reconciliation. The battle is viewed less as a military episode and more as a moment of moral collapse and unnecessary suffering. Internationally, Stalingrad reshaped military thought. For strategists, it demonstrated the critical importance of logistics, urban warfare adaptation, and the risks of overextension. Military academies across the world studied the campaign for its lessons in operational planning and its psychological implications. In particular, the German failure to adapt to deteriorating conditions, coupled with rigid command structures, became a cautionary tale. Historians have continued to debate key aspects of the battle. Questions remain about whether the Sixth Army could have escaped had Paulus disobeyed Hitler's orders. Other controversies center on the exact casualty figures, the conduct of Soviet troops during and after the battle, and the ethical implications of encircling and starving an enemy army. Newly available archival material after the collapse of the Soviet Union enabled a more balanced reassessment, incorporating Soviet sources and testimonies previously inaccessible to Western scholars. The estimates vary, but combined military and civilian deaths on both sides exceed 2 million. The city itself, once a thriving industrial hub on the Volga, was reduced to ash and twisted steel. Entire generations of families were erased. The trauma extended beyond the battlefield, into prisoner-of-war camps, shattered communities, and the memories of survivors who carried the scars of frostbite, hunger, and grief for the rest of their lives. Stalingrad also shaped the geopolitical structure of the post-war world. The Red Army's victory emboldened Stalin's position in the Allied alliance and strengthened Soviet bargaining power in post-war negotiations. It paved the way for the Soviet advance into Eastern Europe, leading to the eventual formation of the Eastern Bloc. In many ways, the Cold War's division of Europe was forged in the ruins of Stalingrad as much as in the conference rooms of Yalta or Potsdam. In popular culture, the battle has inspired hundreds of books, documentaries, and films, from Vasily Grossman's epic Life and Fate to the German film Stalingrad, 1993, to international productions such as Enemy at the Gates, 2001. These representations, though varied in tone and accuracy, reflect the enduring global fascination with the human drama and strategic significance of the battle. Today, Volgograd remains a place of pilgrimage for historians, veterans' descendants, and those seeking to understand the enormity of the Second World War. Annual commemorations on February 2nd mark the city's liberation. Wreaths are laid, silence observed, and the names of the fallen read aloud. For Russians, It remains a source of national pride. For others, it stands as a warning of what industrialized, ideologically driven warfare can become. The legacy of Stalingrad is thus multidimensional: military, political, human, and symbolic. It teaches that even the most disciplined armies can break, that leadership divorced from reality courts catastrophe, and that cities are not merely strategic points on a map, but places where the fate of nations may be decided at the cost of their people. The rubble of Stalingrad was swept away, its factories rebuilt, its people returned, its name changed. But the memory endures, not in the lines of maps or the numbers in ledgers, but in the lessons carried forward by generations. Lessons of sacrifice, miscalculation, resistance, and the terrible price of war when it is fought to the bitterest end.